Well, I'm so excited and pleased this morning to welcome Dr. Leith Anderson to be our speaker this morning. The National Association for Evangelicals Board of Directors unanimously named Leith as its president after twice serving as the interim president. He regularly teaches at seminaries, addresses evangelical concerns with elected officials, councils, denominational executives, and provides theological and cultural commentary to leading news outlets. He's also served on President Obama's Advisory Council on Faith-Based and Neighborhood Leaderships. While at Wooddale Church, Leith's nationally syndicated radio programs Faith Matters and Faith Minute were heard in cities across America and around the world. While at Wooddale, his congregation planted 9 daughter churches, and he retired as its senior pastor after 35 years. Leith is a published author. Most recently, I've seen an article that he co-authored with another gentleman in Christianity Today, and this month's issue of Christianity Today. But he's written over 20 books, the latest of which is Faith in the Voting Booth, Practical Wisdom for Voting Well, and is co-authored by his friend and colleague, Galen Carey. Well, please welcome this morning my good friend and a good friend of the Salvation Army, Dr. Leith Anderson.
Well, if I may dare to start with a quiz, I have a question, especially for anybody who happened to be an English literature major in college. So the question is this: what is the all-time best-selling book originally written in English? And you get an A+ because you picked Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. And you maybe already know the opening paragraph. It goes like this: it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. A Tale of Two Cities was published in 1859, and it is a novel. It is the fiction story of poverty and discouragement in London and in Paris. And it then and now has captured the attention, especially of the English-speaking world. It was 6 years later, after A Tale of Two Cities was published in the East End of London, that William Booth changed from fiction to Christian action in the founding of the Salvation Army to touch the lives of those who, like in Dickens' novel, were poor and discouraged. In 1865, the population of the world was something under 2 billion people, and there was a lot of poverty. Today, the population of the world is estimated at 7.4 billion people, and there are still a lot of poor people. So it's 151 years after the Salvation Army was started, and there's still a need for the Salvation Army. And some may wonder, so how long does all this take? If it's like a race, how long a race is this? And some may be tempted to slow down or even to quit the race. As you know, 2016 is a year for the Summer Olympic Games to be held in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And you will probably rehear a story that is repeated pretty much every 4 years with all of the Summer Olympic Games. It's a story, true story, that comes from the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City and the marathon that was run there. Because of the altitude of Mexico City, it was an exceptionally difficult race. there were runners from 75 nations that were at the starting line. Of those, 54 finished the race. It was a dropout rate of 34%. These are the best runners in the world, and a third of them couldn't even finish the race. Mamo Walde of Ethiopia won the gold medal in 2 hours, 20 minutes, 16 seconds. The last runner finished the race more than an hour later at 3 hours, 25 minutes, 27 seconds. His name was John Stephen Akwari from Tanzania. He had fallen. He had severely cut his knee. He had dislocated the joint. And he kept on running until when he came across the finish line in the stadium, pretty much everybody had gone home. And there were relatively few there to witness the finishing of that race. It was a reporter who came up to Akwari and asked him, "Why did you not retire from the race when you know that you cannot win and will be long last?" And he gave a classic answer. He said, "My country, Tanzania, did not send me 10,000 miles to start the race. My country, Tanzania, sent me 10,000 miles to finish the race." We're Christians. We're disciples of Jesus Christ. And as disciples of Jesus Christ, it is more than just starting the race. It is that we finish the race, even if it takes a long time. So the Bible says a lot about this race with poverty and with discouragement and our responsibility. Jesus, when he began his public ministry, he started out by saying that he had come to preach good news to the poor. And so he was always committed in a special and a unique way to those who were on the margins of society. I've been told several times that there are at least 2,000 references to the poor in the Bible. And while I've heard that a lot, I just did something that if you haven't done it is certainly worth doing. I went to a Bible program in my computer and I typed in poor and a couple of other related words and got all of the references from the beginning of the Bible to the end. I read them all. I read them all the way through. How the Bible consistently talks in Old Testament and New of the poor and the sick and the imprisoned and the alien and the orphan and the widow and the homeless and the hungry. Obviously, I can't read 2,000 references to you, but let me just a few that you may know. Deuteronomy 15:11, a verse that is sometimes quoted in its first half, but not its entirety. There will always be poor people in the land. Therefore, I command you to be open-handed toward your brothers, toward the poor and the needy in your land. Proverbs 29:7, the righteous care about justice for the poor, but the wicked have no such concern. In Proverbs 31, the woman of noble character opens her arms to the poor and extends her hands to the needy. And Jesus' words in Luke 14, when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. So there have always been a lot of poor people in the world, always throughout history. And there are today a lot of poor people in the world. But amazingly, in our generation, something unusual, unprecedented has happened. And that is that there has actually been a reduction in the number of those who are extremely poor. So if you go back to the 1980s, there were 1.37 billion people in the world who lived on less than $1.25 a day. That's taking the minimum calorie need of an individual and barely making it and maybe not making it. 1.33 billion people. But since the 1980s, that number has been going down, especially recently, at the rate of about 70 million people a year. So today, those who are counted among the extremely poor in our world, less than $1.25 a day, is somewhere in the vicinity of 820 million people. It's still an astonishing number, but it's astonishing in the number that had been reduced. In 2000, the UN Millennial Goals set the goal of cutting in half the number of extremely poor people in the world by the year 2015. It was an audacious, impossible, crazy, and by many, a mocked goal. It just couldn't be achieved. Indications are that the number of extremely poor people in the world was reached 5 years ahead of schedule. Not in 2015, but in 2010. So there are so many who are not in that most desperate of categories. But there's still way too many. There are today 3 billion people, almost half of the world's population, that live on less than $2 per day. There are 1 million children every year who are sold into slavery, either in the sex trade or as child soldiers. 30,000 children every day around the world who die of poverty-related causes, all of which must break the heart of God. God, who gave us the Bible, which says less about heaven and church and baptism and many of the things that we talk a lot about, and says so much about poverty and the poor. So most of those in extreme poverty today are in South Asia and in the sub-Sahara of Africa. But let's come to North America, to the United States. The current estimates are that there are slightly over 45 million who are living in relative poverty. 100 years ago, at the beginning of the 20th century, the greatest concentration of poverty in the United States was among the elderly. That has dramatically changed, especially in the last 25 years. So today, the concentration of poverty among the elderly, those 65 years of age and older, is down to 11%. But while that is wonderfully good news, at the same time that the number of older people in poverty has gone down, the percentage and the number of children in poverty has significantly gone up. So in 1980, it was 10% of children in the United States. Today, it's 27% of people in the United States. I say all this, but you know this. You know this far better than I. You know it from experiences. You know it with names like Henry and other names. You know who these people are. The Salvation Army has amazingly been there and continues to be loving and caring, and that's who you are. That's what you do. You work hard and you give generously, and you're impacting the lives of more than 30 million Americans every year. So that when disaster strikes, the Army is there. And when people are homeless and in a doorway, the Army is there. And when they have no place to go, the Army becomes their home. And when addiction cripples, the Army is there. And the pathway of hope, it's just amazing to meet not only the immediate need, but to address the deep systemic needs of those who have been entrapped in poverty, not just for their lifetime, but their parents before them and their children after them, making that kind of a difference. So the theme for today and for this week is to expect change. But how long is that going to actually take? So does everyone go home from Phoenix in 2016 and expect that there's going to be a quick solution, or will it take a year or 10? Or a lifetime? How long does it take? And how do we remain hopeful and anticipating when it turns into a long time? One of Jesus' parables, the one about talents in Matthew 25, tells the familiar story of how this boss goes away on a trip, and before he leaves, he entrusts to 3 of his employees 5, 2, and 1 talent. There's so much we don't know, and it's so difficult to translate monetary units from one time and culture to another. We don't know if they were bronze or silver or gold. Talent was both a measure of weight and a measure of money. But by any of those, it was a lot of money. If it was gold, if we're talking about 5 or 2 or 1 talent of gold, we are talking multiple millions of dollars, perhaps more than the entire annual budget of large Roman provinces. It was Jesus using hyperbole. It must have been. The numbers are so stunningly large. And you know what happened, that when the boss comes back, the guy with 5 changes it to 10, the guy with 2 changes it to 4, and the guy with 1 buried it and returned what was originally entrusted to him. And the parable is most famous for the line that the boss gives to the 2 who got the doubling of the return. And they are told, "Well done, good and faithful servant." But there is a line kind of neglected in that parable which just grabs my attention. It's in Matthew 25:19. It says that after a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. It was after a long time. They must have wondered if the boss was ever going to come back. They must have had days when they thought that they could take the money and just use it for themselves and pay off their own bills. They must have sometimes been elated and other times been discouraged with the boom and the bust of investment. But it takes a long time. It takes a long time to earn a college degree. It takes a long time to write a book. It takes a long time to raise a child. It takes a long time to start and establish a business. And it takes a long time to change society. Jesus' parable gives us a lot to fill our imagination. My guess is that they went through the booms and the busts and the expansions and the recessions, and they did it for a very long time. John Quincy Adams was the son of the second president of the United States, and eventually he became the 6th president of the United States. We may not today know much about him, but he had an extraordinary career. He was the United States ambassador to several European nations. Before he became president, he was the Secretary of State of the United States. While he was president, he established the border between Canada and the United States. He annexed Florida to the United States from Spain. He just about paid off the national debt. He was an amazingly successful and effective president. But the people didn't support him. And so when he ran for re-election, he lost by a massive margin. And then John Quincy Adams did something that no other president had ever done before, nor has anyone ever done it since. And that is, he ran for Congress. And he was elected as a member of the House of Representatives from the state of Massachusetts. And he served in the House for 17 years before he died in office. During those 17 years, I suppose he could have been accused of being a one-issue person. He was adamantly opposed to slavery. He argued cases before the United States Supreme Court. He gave speeches, he wrote articles, he came up with ideas and proposals. He didn't seem to make very much progress at all, but he would not let it go for 17 years until he died in the speaker's room off the rotunda of the United States Capitol in Washington. When he died, there was a new member of the House of Representatives from Illinois' 7th Congressional District who was appointed to the Committee on Arrangements to arrange for the former president's funeral and to accompany his body back to Massachusetts. It was a new member of Congress who had listened to what Adams had to say. He had listened to some of Adams' bizarre proposals, one of which was that if the United States were actually to ever go to civil war over this slavery issue, that some future president could use war power acts to unilaterally set slaves free. It was an idea that no one thought was legal or possible. This young one-term congressman from Illinois, at 39 years old, never re-elected to Congress, was Abraham Lincoln, who became then the 16th president of the United States. And it was he who, when Civil War came, issued the Emancipation Proclamation and set slaves free in this nation in 1862. This is the time when Charles Dickens was writing about London. This is when William Booth was establishing the Salvation Army. This is when Abraham Lincoln followed the path of his mentor, John Quincy Adams, who had died 14 years earlier and crusaded for 17 years before that. It took a long time. It took a really long time. So God has called you to be the voice for and to serve the poor in the name of Jesus. It is a high and a holy calling, and I thank you. Millions of people thank you. Thank you for what you do, but you do it for a long time, for not giving up. Not easy. It's complicated. It's important. It just takes a long time. It was just over 5 years ago that there was a news story that you may have followed. It was actually one of the top news stories of the year 2010. It was on August 5th in 2010 that the San Jose copper and gold mine in the desert of Chile collapsed. And there were 33 miners who were trapped 2,300 feet underground with no possible way that they could ever dig themselves out or survive. For 69 days, the world watched and prayed that they would be rescued. Amazingly, all 33 of them survived and were rescued and were brought to the surface on October 13th, 2010. When they came to the surface, there were over 1 billion television viewers around the world that witnessed their rescue. It's actually been made into a movie. It's worth seeing. The title of the movie is The 33. And you can see for yourself in dramatic form what happened. I can only imagine the ecstasy of family that had waited 69 days, and here their loved ones came up this 21-inch diameter tube for a half a mile up to the surface. It's just astounding story. And the world cheered. If you remember the story, maybe you don't remember the name of Manuel Gonzalez. Probably not. If you watch the movie, The 33, he's not in it. His story isn't part of it. And that's because he wasn't one of the 33 who were trapped underground. He wasn't one of those who was pulled up after more than 2 months needing rescue. No, he was actually, though, the first rider in the capsule. Not up to the surface, but down into the mine. On the day before, on the 12th of October, 2010, Manuel Gonzalez tested the capsule. He got in it, and he rode down for 2,300 feet so that he could be there, and the next day, one by one, help those 33 miners survive and escape. And it was the next day, the 14th of October, that he then finally came out. Can you imagine the risk? But that's what the Son of God did for us. The Bible explains that sin caved in on our world and our human race. And we were under the pile, trapped, doomed, no possible way that we could ever get ourselves out. No digging that would ever help. Absolutely impossible. And then Jesus came down from heaven to earth and into our humanity. Imagine the risk of doing that. He did it so that he could come down to get us out, to save us, to rescue us. It's just hard to imagine. But it's absolutely true. His compassion for us led us down from his perfect heaven into our troubled world so that we might rise to his heaven forever. And that's what the Salvation Army is doing. That's what you're doing. Going to where people are hungry and scared and threatened. And in circumstances it is highly unlikely that they are ever going to dig themselves out of. And so you are the messengers of hope. You are the agents of change. You are like Jesus. And after a long time, because it takes a long time, after a long time, may Jesus himself say, "Good job, well done, good and faithful servant."